Good afternoon and most welcome to 977. We have a very lovely May afternoon here and I'm rather bothered by the lights, so with your permission I will put on the cap because it's becoming, especially now when the sun goes just beyond the horizon, it is actually bother even more. Very fitting. Name of the lecture is an article of Timothy Rogers, for me a person completely unknown, and I'm just throwing this into the basket of today. My really weakened state that I have today is perfect to open up new subjects. And this is actually something I have no idea what it's about. And this is what De Bono called provocation. And it means that you put in something that you didn't plan, you didn't associate. It has to be completely haphazardous. And this is more or less that. Well, it's in the realm of science, so it's not completely. But I will try later on to put in subjects that are completely happenstantial, at least twice a week, somewhere in the vicinity. And you are most welcome to come with suggestions, but preferably things that are not connected to anything else, and maybe subjects that you would think I wouldn't choose either. It could be about hunting or how to swim in the barrier reef.
Exorcism.
Yeah. How to swim in the barrier reef, exorcism. I can actually tell you a tale about the barrier reef. They just discovered here. We always think that all science is fixed and ready, but there had been for a very long time period, almost 100 years, a high prevalence, an oddly high prevalence of cardiac arrest in the barrier reef among swimmers, and also like stroke and cardiac arrest and drowning. And it was a statistical guy who looked at it a couple of years ago, and he was just putting the question down. He didn't have an answer. He was a statistician. He thought it was odd. Why do so many people die? And if you're in the medical business, it would be very hard to ask that question, because you already have sort of not a prejudice, but you think, cardiac arrest and stroke, they're not very related. They're two different things. But the statistician, because of his lack of knowledge, can put them together. It turns out it was something incredibly interesting. They now know the cause of these extra deaths. Kalle, just give us a guess. This is very hard, but thinking could help.
For half a box. They saw a bear.
No, they were swimming.
They saw a swimming bear.
Oh, no. It turned out to be a very, very small mollusk, sort of a jellyfish, and it's just this size.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called, see if I can find the name here. No, look, look, it's interesting in itself. I'm standing on my toes when I try to reach my memory. That goes to show also that memorizing and learning is something we do with our bodies. It's a bodily action. And I will do a lecture about that tomorrow, how we can learn how to memorize, because just having the method is very good. We've had methods since antiquity, but it won't do. We know that for a fact. If you train your memory just with a method, it is not clear that you will advance. You can train your memory your whole life, you wouldn't advance, because until the body is into it, you don't change anything. You don't make any progress. But there's also the Incagindra, I think it was called, this jellyfish, and its sting gives a shock to the system of pain. The very jellyfish is in itself not deadly, but the pain is deadly, because we can only support to a certain level of pain. Our bodies go into cardiac arrest or stroke or drowning. We get too much pain. It's actually the pain that kills. I will never swim in the barrier reef. I decided when I heard about this. That level of pain I don't want to experience. Today I will talk about proximity of light, which is very fitting, thinking about the light. A deconstruction of space, it's called. Just let me go through the introduction. This paper juxtaposes a description of the ontological structure of classical physics, based on Newton's concept of absolute space, with another voice, separate and proximate, which interrupts the discourse and draws attention to unexpressed formal commitments of the description. Tropes and figures push from classical ontology embedded in reciprocal duality towards a promised otherwise within an irreducibly threefold relatedness. Drawing from Levinas postmodernism, the paper intimates the rupture of spatiality in the proximity of light, a deconstruction of the entrenched notion of spatiality in the movement from a geometry of being, ontology, to a grammar of signifyingness, ethics. Drawing from Einstein's physics, the paper intimates a specific way in which generality is manifested in subjective relativism through the trace. Wow, that's a hell of a start. The spatiality of space. Let our starting point be Newton's concept of absolute space. This concept grounds classical physics and is the traditional place from which the leap to Einstein's special relativity theory is taken. In its concreteness, this concept can also function metaphorically as a trope for approaching Levinas' critique of ontology. For Newton, space is an entity in itself, the distinct container of what is real. Newton's absolute space is a literal Euclidean structure in which the spatial points are possibly locations for material objects, bodies. No body can exist without space. Spatial points, on the other hand, exist whether or not they are occupied by bodies. Eternal in duration, immutable in nature, Newton's absolute space situates an ontological structure for the universe. In De Gravitone, Newton writes, space is a disposition of being qua being. No being exists or can exist which is not related to space in some way. God is everywhere. Created minds are somewhere, and body is in the space that it occupies. And whatever is neither everywhere nor anywhere does not exist. And hence it follows that space is an effect arising from the first existence of being, because when any being is postulated, space is postulated. Here is another quote from from Levinas, sorry. But then, no transcendence other than the factitious transcendence of worlds behind the scenes, of the heavenly city gravitating in the skies over the terrestrial city, would have meaning. The being of beings and of worlds, however different among themselves they may be, weaves among incomparables a common fate. It puts them in conjunction, even if the unity of being that assembles them is but an analogical unity. Every attempt to disjoin the conjunction and the conjuncture but emphasizes them. The there is fills the void by the negation of being. Newton's approach often offers some insight into the nature, the figure, the spatiality of space. Let us trace some characteristics. Sameness. Newton's space is homogeneous. Every point in space is exactly like every other point. Leibniz, for example, describes Newton's space as, quote, something absolutely uniform, and without the things placed in it, one point of space does not absolutely differ in any respect whatsoever from another point of space. End of quote. Space thus plays the role of an ubiquitous field of uniformity or sameness upon which reality is inscribed. There is no radical alterity in space. Within this homogeneity, Newton theorizes acceleration, force, power as primary thematizations of motion and change. Another quote from Levinas. A philosophy of power ontology is, as a first philosophy which does not call into question the same philosophy of injustice. Being before the existence, ontology before metaphysics, is freedom, be it freedom of theory before justice. It is a movement within the same before obligation to others. Let's go to the next characteristics of Newtonian space. That is contiguity, I think it's pronounced. Newton's space is a continuum. As he writes in De Gravitone, spaces are everywhere contiguous to spaces, and extension is everywhere placed next to extensions. And so there are everywhere common boundaries to contiguous parts. There is no apparent rupture in space. This imparts upon space as a container an affinity for analysis, for analyticity, for invoking an excluded middle to differentiate and bring together again without the loss or excess. Upon this assumption of contiguity, Newton brings forth a calculus of differentiation. Once more Levinas. But then the term proximity would have a relative meaning, and in the space inhabited by Euclidean geometry, a derivative sense. Its absolute and proper meaning presupposes humanity. Next characteristics is simultaneity. For Newton, the universe is a totality, an assemblage of bodies in instantaneous simultaneous relationship. Like the metaphor of a rigid body, like the Earth as fixed correlation, the universe is a state in space. Space is the rigidity, the instantaneous infinite correlation, the assemblage of simultaneity. Time is added separately, so the universe is seen as a continuous succession of states in space. Newton writes, right? For we do not ascribe various durations to the different parts of space, but say that all endure together. The moment of duration is the same at Rome and at London, on the earth and on the stars, throughout all heavens. And just as we understand any moment of duration to be diffused throughout all spaces, according to its kind, without any thought of its part, so it is no more contradictory that mind also, according to its kind, can be diffused through space without any thoughts of its part. This is coming from De Gravitone. Newton imagines the universe as a totality in a succession of simultaneous existences. This metaphorical picture informs ontology. What is real? What exists? What is? Is the state. Space is a container of this totality, and Newton's universe ontologically privileges space. Another quote from Levinas here. The beings remain always assembled, present in a present that is extended by memory and history. To the totality determined like matter, a present without fissures or surprises, from which becoming is expelled, a present largely made up of representations due to memory and history. And a quote from Levinas. We will have more to say about spatiality, but before we move on, we need to unpack the temporal dimension, the nature of change. And this chapter is called The Limit of Spatiality. Change is a tricky concept in physics. And Newton's theories are no exception. To absolute space he adds absolute time, keeping the two always orthogonal and unmixed. Orthogonal means it's deviating like this. The question of change is enfolded in the question of motion. This is a quote from Levinas. It is the verbalness of the verb that resounds in the predictive proposition. The dynamism of entities is designed and expressed by verbs secondarily, by reasons of its privileged exposure in time. The effort to reduce verbs to functions of signs naively presupposes the division of entities into substances and events, into statics and dynamics to be original. In order to address the foundations of Newton's space-time, it is helpful to go farther back to a pre-citation of the problem of motion, to the earlier Greeks, to the paradoxes of Zeno. Two such paradoxes are presented below. The dichotomy. You have to move there because I'm getting a headache now. If you go into the shade there. Over there. It's back. the dichotomy. Motion is impossible at zero. Consider the case of an arrow launched from a bow, for example. In order to reach the target, the arrow must first travel half the distance to the target. In order to reach then the half of the remaining distance, and so on eternally. The target can never be reached because this requires traversing an infinite number of finite distances, a task that should take an infinite amount of time. Yet arrows do reach targets. We know that. The arrow. Time is a succession of instants, which are themselves indivisible points. Consider the arrow described above. At any instant of time, the arrow must be at rest, because if it were to move during the instant, time must pass. For time to pass, it must be divisible into before and after. And therefore, it is not an indivisible instant. But if the arrow is at rest at every instant in time, there is no motion. Yet the arrow moves. Modern analysis resolves these apparent contradictions through a mathematical limiting procedure. Roughly interpreted, the arrow successfully reaches the target because increasingly smaller distances are traversed in increasingly smaller times, such that the sum of the distances and the times both remain finite, even in the limit of an infinite division. The idea of the infinite is not an intentionality, for the infinite would be the object. Intentionality is a movement of the mind adjusted to being. It takes aim and moves towards a theme. The idea of the infinite consists precisely and paradoxically in thinking more than what is thought, while nevertheless conserving it in its excessive relation to thought. Also coming from Levinas. The underlying construct for analysis of motion is the notion of trajectory or function. The arrow is described by tracing out a path in space as a function of time. X parenthesis t. The functional relation xt connects the specific points in space xi, where the arrow is found in each specific instant on time ti. Motion occurs if at every instant during the journey the arrow is at that appropriate place along the trajectory. And this is coming from Heidegger. Let me see if I can find Heidegger here. Hugh Heidegger, let's see. Heidegger calls this the at theory of motion. In this construct, instants are point-like and have no paths. As with Zeno's paradox, motion during any instant is impossible, because if the arrow moves during an instant, say t, then ti has before and after paths, and therefore is not an instant. Although motion does not occur at any instant, there is motion by virtue of the whole trajectory, which describes the arrow at successive positions during successive times. It is a major problem. And it actually, I'm going to go in here, you can stay in the sun if you want to hear. Getting a headache here, I don't know why. Sorry. There, go for that. You need to use sunglasses soon. While modern analysis may resolve Zeno's dichotomy paradox, it presents new challenges regarding the interpretation motion. These challenges relate to the concept of infinitesimal and the notion of the instantaneous rate of change of varying quantity. And actually this is something Derrida takes up. This is a bit of a surprise. The intervals are not recuperated. The discourse which suppresses the interruptions of discourse in relating them together, does it not maintain the discontinuity behind the knots where the thread is retied? The interruptions of discourse recovered and related within the immanence of the said are conserved as the knots in a retied thread. The tracing of a dichotomy, diachrony, which does not enter into the present, refusing itself to simultaneity. So you see here what Levinas and Heidegger are pointing to is that once we accept Newtonian ideas of space, which is more or less preconceptual, we actually happen to come into a moral dilemma. We make ourselves irresponsible of the happenings of the world. And I realize pretty soon now, once you go into the Newtonian space, there can be no return. It's like a black hole. And all your morals actually go out of the window. It's impossible to retain any morals, because once all the ideas of Newtonian space, which I think actually is related to the mirror image, once those things are set in motion, there is no need for any morality or ethics in the universe. It becomes pointless or an accessory. And I think it was an accessory already for Newton. He just did not realize it. But maybe 40 or 50 years after the gravitone, morality was actually eradicated from history of man. Nobody saw after that point morality as something being of the universe. And no wonder we end up in a world where morale is not very highly appreciated. And I remember that discussion we had on Patrick Stigson's book release with a Norwegian, what was saying, Rakel. I don't even remember her name. She was so shocked about my professor Torbjörn Tännsjö, and I was a bit surprised by her shock. What does she think? We don't believe in morality anymore. Who would be in charge of morale if nobody ever in Swedish politics, at least not the last 60 or 70 years, had any morality in their program? It's not a political point anymore. And I think it's obvious that we don't think morality exists anymore. And one of the reasons is, of course, Newtonian space. It makes us completely unparticipating in the universe, and therefore not guilty of morality. We don't have to act morally if we don't want to, because we're not part of the universe, so to speak. Let me go into that a bit deeper. If my thinking has nothing to do with the universe, what would be the point of having a morale? Because whatever I think, it doesn't affect anything. And therefore, my moral thinking or behavior or acting doesn't have any influence on the universe. Nothing happens. If I act with bad morals, nothing happens. But if I act with good morals, nothing happens. There is no cause and effect. My thinking is almost not part of the universe. And I think our old saving point was actually the butterfly effect, that we said that thinking could affect the world.
But Lars Låström has proved that the butterfly effect works.
Yeah, and of course what Levinas is pointing to here, if we look closer into space, we will see that despite what Newton says, you can look at it further and you realize somewhere we are part of the universe. even our thinking is part of the universe. Because in the unsolvable problem, the Zeno's paradox, therein lies also the solution. And the solution is that we need to deconstruct space and time. Once we do that, we understand that there is a whole set of relations. And Newtonian space and time are oversimplifications. They are just etiquette words for something that is much, much more complex. And oddly enough, both in time and space, we are participating. We are not external observers. But the interesting point made in this article is he sees it from a completely different angle. He sees that already in the layout of space by Newton, this is implied. And this was not given by Newton himself. You already have it when he started. So once more, it's the mirror reflection. Once it's set in motion, it cannot be stopped. And so was the problem also for Newton. And slightly, I'm beginning to realize also the remarks made by Leibniz and Huygens, that were not enough. And I think at that very time, the late 18th century, no, late 17th century, early 18th century, there was no chance for deconstruction of space and time. We had to wait for the beginning of last century to be able to do that. Because that idea was a no idea until quantum mechanics. We could not uncover that someone, somewhere hidden beneath the Newtonian concept of space and time, there is actually problematic nature. And that can only be uncovered once we open up space and time and go into it, as we did very carefully in quantum mechanics. Very interesting article. I have no idea where it stems from. I think this is something printed in Köllerstad, because I recognize the high quality of the print. You see, lucky stroke. Next time maybe exorcism. I say thank you very much, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.
Thank you.